All right, let's get started. We've got a lot to get through today, and all of it will be on the midterm. Speaking of which, the midterm, I had advised that you look at the Edwards lecture before the midterm. I still advise that if anyone is having a technical difficulty, make sure you have the latest version of Real Player for either Windows or the Mac. Real Player is now available for the Mac, and it does work since that's the way I look at it. Of course, I find it a little bit horrifying to look at, so I don't look at it very much. Nevertheless, it's there. Second thing, have we talked about the format of the midterm? Pretty easy English majory type of midterm. But for those of you who are interested in not being surprised, part one is terms, names, blah, blah, blah. Things like Alexander Pope or the Covenant of Grace. Okay. So I want you to identify what they are, but more importantly, I want you to explain what the significance of the item is to the narrative that we are generating in this course, or the set of narratives, right? Significance is everything. 4 out of 5 or 6. So you'll do 4. That should take you about 10 minutes. So don't spend a lot of time on it. The next part is basically the reading check. And we'll ask you to do 10 out of 12 passages that we will give to you. They are reasonably biggish. Like that biggish? Not that you can really see. Say 3 of them fit on a page, something like that. A whole variety of different genres and things like that. We'll ask you to identify 10 out of the 12 by author and title. Very simple. We don't want you to spend a lot of time on it. We say 20 minutes. Don't spend any more than 20 minutes and try to make time on that section. We are giving you passages that we think are distinctive, stylistically and thematically. They will either be things that we have highlighted in lecture or that are, at the beginning of an important section of whatever we're reading, or just like one of those highlight me moments, okay? Not really trying to fool you. I'm not going to find the one passage of one poet that happens to look like another poet. That's not what we're interested in. We're interested, again, in the rhetoric of exemplarity. So we're trying to give you exemplary moments to look at. We'll ask you to identify 10 out of 12. There is no extra credit. You may answer all 12, and we will pick your best 10. So do not worry if you answer 12 and you miss 2 of them. We will not hold that against you, unless they're really, really stupid. Then in that case, we'll just make a note on our secret special grade books and say, okay, this is just clearly an evidence of moronic behavior. No. 10 out of 12, we'll pick your best 10. And then we will ask you to choose 4 of those passages. And this is the real meat of the exam. Take 4 of those things and talk about them. And we'll want you to talk about them, guess what? In ways that pay attention to style and form on the one hand, and thematic and other forms of content on the other. We're really interested in the way in which these things go together. I will list them for you in 3 different sections. It says, A, comment on the rhetorical techniques used in the passage, paying attention to such matters as diction, rhythm, rhyme scheme, scansion, figure of language is appropriate, right? Form, literary interp stuff. Then, comment on the ways in which the passage dramatizes a major theme of the text from which it comes. Okay, so if you get a passage from Emerson's Nature, you'll be wanting to talk about the ways in which it uses those formal things that you've just identified in order to talk about, or even just more largely, just to talk about how this passage gets at something. You might think of it this way. Why is this an exemplary passage from Nature, for example? And then we ask you to compare the treatment of the theme that you've identified there to its treatment in another text by another author. So, nature. Emerson thinks nature is great. Bradford really thinks it's not. That will be an example. But you can't just say that. Then I need a few more sentences really showing me that you can think about what's going on in Bradford. For example, he invokes the howling wilderness, or he invokes the Native Americans before he's even met them. That will refer to specific moments. You don't have to quote them, but just point to specific moments in the text so that we know you've read and thought about the text, right? And if you had world enough in time, you would be able to expound eloquently at great length. But this is shorthand, okay? Any questions? Is there an extra credit? There might be. No, but you shouldn't worry about it. Okay, if you want to worry about it, just think about, I'm not interested in dates per se, but I am interested in the fact that certain writers come before other writers, certain texts came before other texts. So I'm interested kind of in sequence. You need to know something about sequence so you know who influenced whom and what were parallel. Okay, so word to the wise. Any questions? Yes?
The later possession of
Yeah. It's true. They'll be up by tonight at, say, 9 o'clock. Promise. I will even send them all to you. So make sure, I will have to send them. Apparently people have trouble when I send more than one document via Blackboard, so I will send them in separate messages. Okay? Terms will probably come from there, so you might want to just have a gander. All right. Sorry about that. I have been a little bit slow. I've been changing things around so that what I wrote before doesn't apply, and then I have to go and do it, and then they pile up, and you know the way it goes, right? All right. Any other questions? Remember, this was boot camp. I'm actually feeling like I'm taking it easy on everybody this year. All right, fine. Try to get here early. I mean, my exams in this course are long, and you're going to make your hands hurt, and you might want to build an extra, blowing on my hand time or whatever. Just try to get in here early. We are a little crowded. I've decided not to try to go for another room so we can have double seating, because that always confuses people and people don't show up. So, all right, let's do some work. This is Emerson from a daguerreotype in the 50s, I think. Now, I'm going to start with one of the things you've probably gathered is that I'm kind of interested in the way in which cultural forms, ideas, figures get transmitted through time. Right? So we've already talked about kind of contemporary appropriations of some of the ideas that we've been thinking about. So how Winthrop is appropriated by Ronald Reagan, for example, is a very showy example of how cultural forms can change. And ultimately, when we get to the Scarlet Letter, we'll see that that's what that book is fundamentally about in many respects. How do you try to script something and then have that script go awry? Once you put a cultural symbol out there, once you write a book, how can you control the meanings? I want to suggest to you that Hawthorne knows that you can't control those meanings. You're a writer, you write with an eye towards a horizon of expectations, but it's an inexact science. You may intend to meet it head on and find that there's something about that horizon that has changed, and your book will not have the reception that you thought it would. And that could be good or bad. Make the movie you want to make. Don't do any pre-screening. Just make it. Make it indie. Do what you want. And who knows? It might win Best Picture. Usually it doesn't. And the fact that, it made $20 million usually is a problem, but maybe not anymore. So anyway, horizon of expectations, right? Okay. So I want to talk about a moment of Emerson's reception that comes from around the time of Reagan, right? Because you might imagine that Reaganism, with its stress on individualism, and Emerson would go together. Although Reagan, I guess maybe Emerson wasn't Christian enough for Reagan or something. His speechwriters didn't tend to ever invoke him. But in the fall of 1988, the Reebok Corporation ran an advertising campaign which has become kind of infamous among people who study these sorts of things. It was based on the slogan, Reebok's Let You Be You. Okay? Reebok's Let You Be You. And the television commercials that spearheaded this campaign were shot in bright primary colors over a soundtrack of tango music. And there were brief scenes. Each one had a spoken caption that came from Emerson's self-reliance. So it was meant to dramatize kind of idiosyncratic behavior that was nevertheless linked to individualism, right? So things like, whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, to be great is to be misunderstood. I think there were 10 scenes in the long commercial and 10 captions. And for years, I had this on some videotape that I was trying to rustle up, and I don't know, I probably taped Star Trek The Next Generation over it or something like that. In any case, it's now on YouTube. Oh, we love YouTube. So I'm going to show it to you, I hope. All things being equal, you'll get a sense of what, well, just let me show it to you.
Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. To be great is to be misunderstood. There is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself for better, for worse, as his portion. Insist on yourself,
people found this campaign somewhat enigmatic. They may not have recognized Emerson. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of them. So if you like these things, they're kind of cute. I will send you, I'll post the link. And actually, I might even post the actual thingamajig on my blog. Nevertheless, we have it now. So fine, okay. Where were we? So Emerson, right? So that ad campaign is using Emerson, the quintessential prophet of American self-reliance, or as we would say, individualism, to sell sneakers. Now, this ad campaign actually raised the hackles of an editor at the daily newspaper where Emerson had gone to college. The Harvard Crimson ran an opinion piece that was entitled "Stomping on Individualism," that deplored the appropriation of the work of the man whose name adorns that university's philosophy building. Right? Emerson Hall is where they teach philosophy at Harvard, though interestingly, they rarely teach Emerson in Emerson Hall. I mean, certainly when back in the day, you had to be there was an oddball philosopher who was interested in aesthetics and literature, you know, one of those types. And his name's Stanley Cavell, and he taught Emerson. But for the most part, Emerson has had a kind of renaissance since this time. But even still, people regard him in professional philosophy departments, they regard Emerson with suspicion. I don't think he's on any syllabus that gets taught here at NYU. It's just not analytical philosophy at all. And I think we'll try to understand why. Although it was commonplace to say in the turn into the 20th century that Emerson was America's greatest philosopher. In the first Cambridge history of American literature from about 1917, that's how he's called. He's denoted as America's great philosopher. So something has happened to the discipline of philosopher. You might say the horizon of expectations for what constitutes legitimate academic philosophy has changed. Okay, in any case, this editorial writer deplored the appropriation of Emerson's work. And she wrote this: "The postmodern randomness of the ads is meant to stress individuality and uniqueness, as does Emerson's philosophy." Individuality and uniqueness. But she complains, the ads distort that philosophy by implying that Emersonian self-reliance can be found in, of all things, sneakers. And she describes Emerson as the quintessential American philosopher, which is, as I said, a disputed claim in many philosophy departments. And she points out that the campaign emphasizes what she calls the crucial American dialectic of individual versus community, what we talked about with Reagan and with Winthrop. She argues, though, that the ads are based on a duplicitous premise, as if she says they definitely obscure the fact that buying Reeboks is not an act of individualism, but an act of conformity. Okay, so buying shoes to express your individuality is, especially mass-produced shoes made by sweatshops and wherever it's meant they're made, is probably not a legitimate way to express your individuality. Or is it? I mean, what do we mean by individualism? Oh, by the way, though the author, maybe this name rings a bell for you, the author of this piece went on to become a screenwriter. Her name is Aline Brosh. Ring a bell? Anybody? She wrote a movie. Was celebrated when it came out. Even had some Oscar nominations. I think it might have even won the screenwriting award. It was called The Devil Wears Prada. Have you seen The Devil Wears Prada? It's good. Okay, so she refers to Emerson as the quintessential American philosopher, right? That was when she was a young tyke, about your age. Extolling the virtues of some kind of authentic American individualism as if there were such a thing, and sneering at conformity. Okay, so individualism, not conformity. And I would suggest to you that that places her and the Crimson editorial that she writes within the kind of mainline thinking of American political and cultural philosophy that's dominated American culture since at least Emerson, but probably we should go back to Franklin and we should see glimmerings of it all the way back to something like Winthrop, that dynamic of individual versus community. How are we going to harness the individual's energies that Winthrop is trying to work with? What I want to suggest to you, therefore, from what we've seen already, is that what she misses is that individualism and conformity, or let's call it community, are inextricably linked. And what's at stake really is the link that you're going to make. How are you going to depict that link? Remember, Emerson is going to follow Franklin in trying to put individual first and society second. Winthrop is going to put community first and individual second. Community is supposed to enfold, bind, remember the ligaments of Christ's love. That's going to bind the individual to society. So you might say conceptions of the individual are probably a necessary concession to the modern 17th century, whereas for Franklin and then for Emerson, society itself is the necessary concession. It's a second-order construct. I'll talk a little bit more about this. It's a second-order construct, kind of necessary evil, right? So that's what we want to be thinking about. Did you notice the word individualism in your reading of Emerson for today? Anybody? I'd hope not, because it's not there. It's not available for him for use. It's such a new term, right? This idea that the individual has an a priori and primary reality, society is a second-order derived construct. This idea is really new at the beginning of the 19th century. And it's becoming a kind of bedrock principle of American liberalism, or of liberalism more generally. But it's so new that there isn't actually a word for it. And it probably comes into American usage when Democracy in America is translated for an American audience in 1844. 41. It's the first time it's published in the United States. And Tocqueville here, in the second volume, you know about Democracy in America, right? Alexis de Tocqueville comes in the 30s and he looks around. He goes on a kind of long tour. He's ostensibly supposed to study, I think, the prison system as a source, but he starts generalizing out and broadening out, and he's looking to understand what he sees to be the future. Right? The Enlightenment has taken hold. Democracy is what's going to be the form of culture. There are some people who comment on Tocqueville as saying he's actually very sympathetic still to the old aristocracy, the Ancien Régime, and therefore he's trying to look for grounds of hope for those who are still interested in aristocratic structures. Where can we find the vestiges of aristocracy in the United States? And that's part of what he keys on in those particular moments. But he really thinks that democracy is the way of the future, and with it a number of other concepts that go with it. Individualism is one of them. So he says it's a word recently coined to express a new idea. Our fathers, he says, only knew about egoism. Some translated egotism. The translator of that first American edition writes a footnote in which he apologizes. I adopt the expression of the original, however strange it may seem to an English ear, because I know of no English word exactly equivalent to the expression, right? It's a brand new word. It's so new that Emerson doesn't have it in Self-Reliance. He doesn't have it to use. In fact, the first time, this is why I was thinking 44, when he publishes the series of essays in 42, it's not in current usage. By the time he gets to 1844 in the second series and publishes an essay called New England Reformers, he does have the term individualism available, right? So this is part of this new intellectual technology. This is how Tocqueville defines individualism. He calls it a calm and considered feeling which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the masses of his fellows and withdraw into the circle of his family and friends. With this little society formed to his taste, he gladly leaves a greater society to look after himself. So there's a difference between individualism and egotism or egoism. It's not only self-centeredness. In fact, it isn't primarily that. It's a way of approaching society that involves isolation from the mass. And it's a social concept, even in Tocqueville's terms, because you gather a close community around your family, maybe some of your friends, and then you start to look after yourself. And he thinks this is a problem. Egoism, he says, springs from a blind instinct, while individualism is based on misguided judgment rather than depraved feeling. But in the end, they boil down to the same thing. Egoism sterilizes the seed of every virtue. Individualism at first only dams the spring of public virtues. But in the long run, he says, it attacks and destroys all the others too, and finally merges in egoism. So ultimately, you might say they boil down to the same thing. Finally, one of the things he's talking about in terms of aristocracy is that he thinks about the ways in which this is a new phenomenon. And one of the things that he says, I mean, you might think about how this is compatible with the argument that Winthrop makes at the beginning of A Model of Christian Charity about hierarchy, is that in aristocratic societies there was a hierarchy and a set of obligations, and everybody knew who owed what to whom. Democracy changes that. He says democracy breaks the chain, frees each link, and thus as social equality spreads, there are more and more people who, though neither rich nor powerful enough to have much hold over others, have gained or kept enough wealth and enough understanding to look after their own needs. Such folk owe no man anything and hardly expect anything from anyone. They form the habit of thinking of themselves, again that word, in isolation, and imagine that their whole destiny is in their own hands. Right? leave the idea of the community behind. Each man, therefore, he says, is forever thrown back on himself alone, and there is danger that he may be shut up in the solitude of his own heart. Right? Dramatic description. And he'd probably see this as exactly the problem that he's talking about. Right? Emerson's famous lines from Self-Reliance: to believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. Speak your latent conviction, and it shall be the universal sense, for the inmost in due time becomes the outmost, and our first thought is rendered back to us by the trumpets of the last judgment. This is what I'm thinking that you will probably be thinking in those moments when you don't say something when I ask a question and then somebody else says exactly the thing that you were thinking. Emerson says, believe in yourself, reverence yourself, right? Speak up, speak out. Your first thought is probably the right thought. And if you change your mind tomorrow, we'll talk about this later on, your first thought tomorrow is the right thought for tomorrow, even if it contradicted your first thought today. But we'll get to that. This would drive Tocqueville nuts, right? I mean, this is exactly the kind of problem that he's pointing to. Thinking that's what's true for you is true of everybody, thinking that you hold your destiny in your whole hand. But you know what? Almost immediately, in the context of U.S. discourse, Tocqueville's insight, and I think it is an insight into the way democratic societies work, was immediately appropriated and given a new meaning, right? So in a very early review, or a very early piece that's related, that even precedes Tocqueville's own publication of the second volume, there's an anonymous piece in the Democratic Review that writes this: the history of humanity is the record of a grand march at all times leading to one point, the ultimate perfection of man. The course of civilization is the progress of man from a state of savage individualism to that of an individualism more elevated, moral, and refined. Right? So we want to move from the state of nature's version of individualism to produce societies that are going to cultivate a new kind of individualism that can be elevated, moral, refined, civilized. And Emerson's thinking in this period, you might say, has a lot of affinities with that kind of belief. This is a journal entry from 1833. Democracy, freedom has its roots in the sacred truth that every man hath in him the divine reason, or that all men are created capable of so doing. That is the equality and the only equality of all men. To this truth we look when we say, reverence thyself, be true to thyself. Today Emerson would probably have a blog. But one of the things that he did was cultivated the habit of keeping a journal constantly. And he drew on these journal entries for the lectures, the public performances that he gave. Right? So that's one of the things to understand a little bit. We'll say more about this. But one of the things about what's weird about Emerson's writing is that it almost seems like greatest hits of my journal. Like, where did I, if he had, God, who knows what would have happened if he had had word processing and it was easier to synthesize things. Maybe he still wouldn't have done it. But I mean, the idea of going through his journal entries and thinking, like, what have I been thinking about the individual, and then pulling these things together, it's oftentimes that you get the paragraphs have kind of leaps of thought. They don't necessarily have smooth philosophical transitions. They don't seem argued. It's kind of like insight after insight after insight. But you can see that that's kind of what he's interested in. He's interested in the idea of revelation, which he believes the Enlightenment, whole strains of Enlightenment philosophy, have unjustly de-emphasized. So that's one of the important things to understand about Emerson. So, whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Does that remind you of anybody that we've read? Must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Does that remind you anything? If we were looking for an antecedent to this thought, where would we find it? So on Wednesday, if there's a passage from Emerson and it's not appropriate to compare it to Bradford, you might want to think about comparing it to this guy. Right? Remember that moment when he's talking about he doesn't believe that you should do things from precept, but on the other hand, he thinks there's probably good sense behind many of the precepts. He wants to test those precepts out for himself. He's probably going to do, for example, what the preacher would tell him to do, but he's not going to do it because the preacher told him to do it. Emerson, you might say, is taking that slightly farther. right? Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered even by the name of goodness. I'll interpolate the even by the name of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Just because they say it's good, I can think. And remember this idea here, right? The equality of men is that every man hath in him the divine reason, all right? So we're seeing that Emerson is taking off from those strains of enlightened philosophy that say reason is a faculty that God gave us, and we need to use it. Emerson goes further. There's a lot of references to the soul in all of the writings that you looked at. He thinks that everybody's soul is almost like a direct communication line to the divine, that we all have some of the God stuff in us. Sometimes he'll call it the soul, sometimes he'll think of it as reason. For him, they're kind of interconnected. You would be doing an injustice to what is divine in you to mistrust yourself. And if you were going to subscribe to that total depravity thing, oh, come on. How can having a soul be squared with the idea of total depravity? See, that's the thing about Emerson. He's not interested in those kinds of arguments about the fallen nature of man. And you'll see that he makes references to the fall of man. But the references that he makes to the fall of man are completely compatible with the kind of thinking that we saw in Kant, right? That enlightenment is the process of moving out of your own self-incurred immaturity, when you don't dare to think for yourself. Kant says, dare to be wise. Emerson would agree, and that's because Emerson, frankly, is a kind of American Kantian, right? So one place to think of is that Emerson is inheriting from Franklin and maybe even moving a little bit further. I would suggest to you that the difference between these two lies in their attitudes towards religion, right? Remember what we talked about. Edwards and Franklin stood on a cusp between Calvinism or New England Congregationalism and the Enlightenment. Edwards is trying to find a way to manage the new Enlightenment technology to make it compatible with the old religion. Franklin is trying a way to minimize the damage that thinking along the lines of the old religion can do to keep us from moving forward. So he really is trying to de-emphasize religion. Think back to that passage when he talks about providence or a guardian angel or some unexpected chance. All of these things might have saved me from what would have gone wrong you would expect from my want of religion, right? For him, they're all equal. Providence, which is destiny and things being foreordained, or chance, who knows? And by virtue of putting those things together in the same sentence, not alone like as if they were co-equal, is a radical destabilization of the idea of providence. For Emerson, you might say, the Enlightenment is going too far. Emerson is a Unitarian. So that is, we might say, it's an early 19th century descendant of New England Congregationalism, but it is a far more liberal version of that in the 19th century. Right? You want to say that Calvinism, as we've seen it, stresses overall Christ's love as expressed through his sacrifice on the cross. And it comes with this idea of the total depravity of humankind and the necessity of God's intervention in order for us to be saved. We don't deserve anything. There is no way for human beings to perfect themselves except through the reception of God's grace, which God gives as he sees fit. Emerson and the Unitarians stress not the death of Christ, but the life and teachings of Christ. So it isn't Christ's death that is the model, finally, of his love, but his life, the things that he teaches, the example that he sets of good behavior. Right? And Emerson enters Harvard College, which at the time he's the second of his brothers to enter the school. It's still a place where he was expected probably to become a minister. He wasn't. It might make you happy to know, he wasn't a particularly good student at Harvard. So you can be a great intellectual and not necessarily be a good student in college, although I wouldn't recommend it. He did win prizes for writing, including one of which I myself am particularly fond. It's called the Bowdoin Prize for writing, and Emerson was one of the winners of it. In any case, he leaves Harvard with a suspicion, you might say, of organized religion, so he tries his hand at school teaching. He begins to study for the ministry more seriously in 1825, and he begins the practice of keeping journal entries to try to produce a new sermon each week. His father had been a Unitarian clergyman. But again, if we think about this as a progression from conservative to liberal, there are certain ways in which we might say Emerson is even a further a further progression to more liberal, right? Any kind of organized religion, even Unitarianism, comes to seem kind of binding to him. And he has a dispute with the ministers at Harvard and in Boston about the celebration of the Lord's Supper, and it leads him to be banned from Harvard for a while. But you might say that the Unitarians become very interested in Lockean psychology, the stuff that also interested Edwards, right? And they are really thinking about using Enlightenment thinking as a way of combating what they thought of as Calvinist superstition. They were therefore a kind of liberal denomination. So you would put Emerson to the right, if moving from liberal to more conservative to liberal, Emerson would probably be out here. And yet, it's more complicated than that. Because even while he finds Unitarianism, which is an Enlightenment-influenced version of New England Congregationalism, as opposed to this, which is a strongly Calvinist-inflected version, Emerson thinks that Franklin's account of the Enlightenment is impoverished. There is something wrong with the way the Enlightenment has put so much stress on both human consciousness and on philosophically materialist modes of thinking. Something is missing. It's not enough. And that something is what religion is supposed to do. So there's a way in which organized religion is too strict for him, but the Enlightenment is too impoverished for him. It doesn't give you a full account of the human life, human consciousness. He wants to restore something of that idea that the central drama in the human existence has something to do with God and spirituality. He just doesn't find any account of it that he's read to be fully satisfactory. So there's a way in which I want you to see these essays as a kind of American religion. This is a kind of new religious text, and Emerson is part of that. On the other hand, he is very much thinking about building on Enlightenment philosophies, and particularly the kind of philosophy that we would see in something like Immanuel Kant. So his first major philosophical text is Nature from 1836. And it really, we would identify it as what we would call a piece of American transcendentalist thinking. And what I want to suggest to you is that transcendentalism in the US does draw on German idealist philosophy, the transcendentalism of Immanuel Kant. Although Kant, Emerson gets his Kant less from Kant than from the way it was processed by thinkers like Coleridge and Carlyle. Nevertheless, Kant is in the background of it. And you might say that what Emerson's larger project is to kind of domesticate Kantian thinking for American soil. And one way of thinking about it, therefore, is that part of what he really brings into it that Kant doesn't have so much is the idea of religion or spirit or revelation. Okay? Revelation is compatible with Kantian modes of thinking, but Emerson wants to stress that further. So you might say that what we find is a kind of battle between Unitarian epistemology, so the Unitarian account of the way that knowledge comes about, and also Lockean psychology, right? So there's a sense in which Unitarian epistemology is, I probably shouldn't have written verses up here. They really kind of go together. Unitarians believe that knowledge comes about in part through the way in which Locke described sensory understanding, right? That part of what we come to understand is what's written on our senses. That's the first kind of sensory perception becomes the first data that we use. Then we use reason to work on that. In Emerson's terms, coming from Coleridge, he would interpose one thing in between there. He would say that we get sensory data, we apply our understanding to it, but then we finally go and apply this extra super faculty that's called reason. And that's the thing that sparks some of the design. So there's a you might say a concept that Emerson is domesticating from Kant that is something like a kind of higher reason. So that's one of the things that we're seeing. The transcendentalism in the United States becomes almost a kind of quasi-religious movement, although if you asked somebody like Thoreau, who is constantly identified as a transcendentalist, he probably would deny that fact. So it's Kant, as interpreted by people like Goethe, Carlyle, and Coleridge. This becomes the way in which it works its way into Emerson. and again, understanding as a first faculty, but Emerson wants reason to mean even more than other Enlightenment thinkers want it to mean. Reason is somehow going to be linked to the soul. All right, let's take a look at some text here. How about page 1131 in the Norton? This is the section of nature that's called Idealism. And I think you might get a sense of what he's talking about if we look at the text more closely here. On page 1131, this is the first full paragraph. It appears that motion, poetry, physical and intellectual science, and religion all tend to affect our convictions of the reality of the external world. But I own that there is something ungrateful in expanding too curiously the particulars of the general proposition that all culture tends to imbue us with idealism. Right? And I want to focus on this. We've talked about idealism a little bit when we talked about Winthrop. Idealism is not the idea that, philosophical idealism is not the idea that we should pursue a certain ideal. Right? It's not the same as good behavior, you might say. It's rather a way of thinking that presupposes a difference between appearance and reality. And remember we talked about that the Puritans are deeply suspicious of appearance in the world for the reasons that we've outlined that have to do with their idea of the fall of humankind. And they believe that the world that you can't see, the invisible church, is in fact the real world. So they would be classed as philosophical idealists. They are interested, I'll give you these terms now so you can see them. They are interested, as many later idealistic philosophers are, in this distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal. The phenomenal is the world of phenomena and matter, the world that we see. The noumenal is the world of spirit or ideas or the soul. It's the world that we don't see, right? So generally speaking, idealism, philosophical idealism in Emerson's day maintains that what is real is in some sense going to be this noumenal world, and then it gets even more complicated. Because how do you have access to the noumenal world? Well, even if you believe that you have a soul, your access is going to be through your own mind. So you might say that the first true philosophical idealist is somebody that's mentioned a few pages earlier. This is page 1126 in the footnote, number 3. It's Bishop Berkeley, who takes off from Locke's descriptions of sensory experience in the essay on human understanding. And he says here, the footnote says that Emerson uses Bishop George Berkeley as a representative of the notion that we cannot know ideas, that we can know ideas only in the mind and cannot know material things in themselves. And just to say a little bit more about this, Berkeley is extending this to all perception. And he's arguing that only sensations or ideas are real. Right? I don't want to get too far into this, but this is the philosophical discourse that Emerson is inserting himself into. And that's what he means on page 1131 when he says that a little bit further on from the point, so it's the beginning of the second full paragraph. It is, in fact, the view which reason, both speculative and practical, that it is philosophy and virtue take. That is, philosophy and virtue take. For seen in the light of thought, the world always is phenomenal, and virtue subordinates it to the mind. Okay. Then he goes on, 1132. This will start to become a little clearer, I think. When he goes on to the practice, the idea of spirit. So we've moved from, you might say, in the progression of chapters in nature, we've moved from something that looks like, the world itself, to the idea of idealism, and finally to another chapter here on spirit. Take a look at the fifth paragraph. 3 problems are put by nature to the mind. What is matter? Whence is it? And where to? The first of these questions only the ideal theory answers. Idealism saith, matter is a phenomenon and not a substance. Idealism acquaints us with the total disparity between the evidence of our own being and the evidence of the world's being, right? He says the idealist would suggest that we can really only know ourselves and we can really only know what's in our mind because everything that we see is filtered through our perceptions. So our mind is perfect. The other is flawed at best. We can't really be assured about it at all. The other, he says, incapable of any assurance. The mind is a part of the nature of things. The world is a divine dream from which we may presently awake to the glories and certainties of day. Again, see how he's twisting that rhetoric of enlightenment that we've seen in places like people like Jonathan Edwards. Idealism, he said, is a hypothesis to account for nature by other principles than those of carpentry and chemistry. And by that, by carpentry and chemistry, a kind of mathematical view of the world, he's talking about materialist philosophy. So in short, what he's saying is, look, idealism is trying to get us beyond the limitations of materialist philosophy. But guess what? There are limitations to idealist philosophy as well. Right? So that's what's going to move him into this realm of spirit. It's in the next sentence. Yet, if it only deny the existence of matter, it does not satisfy the demands of the spirit. It leaves God out of me. It leaves me in the splendid labyrinth of my perceptions to wander without end. Right? So look where he's gotten to. Materialist philosophy, not enough. Idealist philosophy, okay, that's an improvement. It says it's just a more supple way about the way in which we understand the world. It makes us realize that, the importance of our own perceptions. But what guarantees are there about anything that we think? I mean, everybody wonders this sometimes. When I say red, is it really the same thing that she means when she says red? How do we know? How do we know that we're seeing the same things? How do I know that that I am not actually at this moment? This is a famous thought experiment by Robert Nozick, who used to teach at Harvard. It's like, how do I know that at this very moment, or how do you know that at this very moment you're not actually somewhere in a vat, call it Mars, the subject of an experiment that Martians have plugged into you and have simulated your own reality? When Nozick thought up this thought experiment, this was before The Matrix. Anybody see The Matrix? Matrix 1, of course. Actually, I like 2 and 3 fine. They missed an opportunity. We talk about this some other time. They missed an opportunity there by going all bang, bang, bang. But nevertheless, how do you know that you are not part of some Martian experiment, that every single thing you encounter is an incredibly elaborate simulation? How do you know, in fact, to put it in those terms, that you're not part of the Matrix? That's a problem philosophically, right? How can you be sure? Emerson knows. Emerson is sure. But what does he need in order to be sure? He needs God, right? So that's it. He needs this idea of spirit, because otherwise you're just wandering around in this maze of your own thinking. What's going to guarantee? You might say it's a reconfigured version of providence, right? If it only denied the existence of matter, it doesn't satisfy the demands of the spirit. It leaves God out of me. It leaves me in the splendid labyrinth of my perceptions to wander without end. Then the heart resists it because it balks the affections in denying substantive being to men and women. Okay, so this is an expression of Emerson's Transcendentalism. He's telling us that no religion or philosophical system, and by this he's placing a lot of Enlightenment theories in this, into this idea, that places God outside of the self is going to be acceptable to him. God is inside through the reason, through the soul, and that gives you a guarantee that you are not wandering only in the labyrinth of your own mind. Right? So one of the things that we want to say is that Franklin and others are trying to get the revelation out of philosophy. You look at Brown's novel, you're like, wow, revelation there is unreliable at best, and sometimes it's, conversion to the dark side, right? You're going to start killing panthers and eating the reeking fibers of the, okay, that's not necessarily the kind of conversion we're all hoping for. Emerson says, wait a minute, I want to bring back revelation. Emerson is fundamentally more optimistic, you might say, than other Romantic writers that we've started to look at about human nature. And he's more optimistic about human nature than the Calvinists were. There's often a word that's associated with him. It's the optative mood. Emerson, that doesn't mean optimistic, but Emerson is interested in in language and in the language of possibility. He's interested in process, as we'll see. Okay. Before we look a little bit more closely at nature, I do want to say something about Emerson's style of writing which you might have found disturbing or even annoying. So I've started to talk about this. Emerson was part of what was called the Lyceum movement. So it means he got, communities were interested in self-improvement. Today we have book groups. Then people would pool their money together and hire a speaker and come and give lectures on subjects. Course of philosophy, you'd hire Emerson to come and he'd speak to you in a lyceum, in an auditorium, and you would listen and you'd have kind of these edification, these socially, and intellectually edifying moments. Fine. Emerson actually tried to make a career out of this, and for 25 years after the death of his first wife, and he goes to Europe, he comes back, he's part of this lyceum circuit. So you might say that instead of giving sermons, he's now giving public lectures. But the lectures take a slightly sermonic form. He's often able to choose his own topics, but always there's a kind of doctrine that he is trying to promote. But I want to say something about this style. Again, he's picking out nuggets of thinking from his journals. He's also thinking a little bit on his feet as he writes these things. Then he writes them up and he puts them into essay form. But the essays that we have bear some of the hallmarks of oral delivery, especially this leaping from one idea to another, or an almost a sometimes tangential or associative train of thought, rather than what we might think of as something that's strictly logical or syllogistic. Or if you want to say it's a different kind of logic, it's an associative kind of logic. Let's take a look at page 1168, and I'll give you a famous passage that kind of embodies what it is that I'm talking about here. Again, one of the things about Emerson is he's asking you to think anew. And sometimes the price of thinking anew, and this is why I think that Emerson is close to, he makes an approach to what we might call a kind of cosmopolitan mode of thinking that stresses the importance of understanding fallibilism. At the top of 1168, he's worried about all the things that we've thought before. Why should you keep your head over your shoulder? Why drag about this monstrous corpse of your memory, lest you contradict somewhat you have stated in this or that public place? Suppose you should contradict yourself. What then? It seems to be a rule of wisdom never to rely on your memory alone, scarcely even on acts of pure memory, but bring the past for judgment into the thousand-eyed present and live ever in a new day. Trust your emotion. In your metaphysics, you have denied personality to the deity, yet when the devout motions of the soul come, yield to them heart and life, though they should clothe God with shape and color. Leave your theory as Joseph his coat in the hand of the harlot, and flee. And then this is the famous passage. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divined. Little ones. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. He may as well concern himself with his shadow on the wall. Out upon your guarded lips, sew them up in the pack thread. Do, else, if you would be a man, speak what you think today in words as hard as cannonballs, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything that you say today. Ah, then exclaimed the angel ladies, you shall be sure to be misunderstood. Misunderstood! It's a right fool's word, Emerson says. It's so bad, then, to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Copernicus, and Galileo, and Newton, and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. And you might then again go back and think of the model of Jesus in the New Testament. I mean, Jesus speaks how? How does he teach? It's a form that Jesus uses. Parable. Yeah, he uses a parable. Why does Jesus speak in parables? Why not just say it? I mean, this is, we're not going to do in 2 minutes what theologians have spent careers and whatnot. People probably been burnt for less. But why speak in parables? Why not just say it plainly? Well, if you're interested in this, it's different in the different Gospels. I mean, one thing you would say, people say, well, storytelling draws you in. You understand. People can, links to their experience, they understand, and then they say, oh. Rather than just a dry precept, you illustrate it with a story. But there's a moment in Mark. This is fascinating for those of you. You go to Mark, and he does his first bit of parables, and then he explains the parables not to his audience, but to his disciples, so that the disciples kind of have inside knowledge. It's like they get the cliff notes. And he says, but when we speak outside, we'll speak open. When we speak other than openly. It's an interesting thing. There's a certain way in which Jesus is thereby leaving himself open to being misunderstood. And you could potentially argue that there's a whole lot of misunderstanding in the way that Christianity becomes institutionalized, so that somehow the religion that's supposed to be turn the other cheek, the religion of charity, of humility and humbleness, became, well, the great institutionalized structures that the churches became, that were all about pomp and circumstance, and even today sometimes may lose track of their mission. In any case, Emerson has good precedent for thinking about this, but that's what he thinks. Emerson says to be great is to be misunderstood. He's willing to take the chance. He's willing to contradict himself. So I want you to understand that one of the things that Emerson does, typically, his mode of thinking, is to take what would seem to be a kind of liability and turn it to his advantage. A French critic named Maurice Gounod published a very big study that was called An Uneasy Solitude. And he said this: a French mind, however open or unprejudiced it might be, is hardly ever comfortable with Emerson's thought. Fragmentary in the extreme, weak in structure even when striving for order, fertile in contradictions and second thoughts and non sequiturs, and so indifferent to logical rigor as to seem positively unsound. Emerson, this guy Gounod says, was no Pascal, and therefore, he says, one has to try to read Emerson with a virgin mind, so to speak, following the movement of his thought, experiences the alteration of the inward tides if one wants to catch the original quality of the work. And you can see that's why it doesn't look like philosophy to most professional philosophers. It looks like something else. Think of it, that's a good metaphor, I think. Tidal. It's fragmentary. It jumps. You'll eventually see when you read Whitman's poetry why Emerson was such an inspiration, because Whitman also has a kind of ebb and flow in his lines of poetry. It's almost like Whitman does to poetic form in terms of opening up the constraints. If Bryan starts opening up the constraints, Whitman blows them open. And Emerson is one of the people who serves as his kind of guru, quite literally. He hears Emerson speak about the poet. We'll read that essay when we do Whitman, and has his mind completely, is completely transformed. Take a look then at page 1172 later on in Self-Reliance. Emerson writes in a journal entry from 1837, can I not conceive the universe without contradiction? And his answer is no, basically, but that's not going to be a liability for him. He embraces contradiction. And he embraces contradiction because he thinks it's a crucial part of process, of what we might call the process of enlightenment or spiritual awakening, or learning to use the reason, or Emerson would probably say learning to be self-reliant. Okay, so look at the bottom of 1172. Life only avails, not the having lived. Power ceases in the instant of repose. It resides in the moment of transition from a past to a new state, in the shooting of the gulf, the darting to an aim. This one fact the world hates, that the soul becomes. For that forever degrades the past, turns all riches to poverty, all reputation to a shame, confounds the saint with the rogue, shows Jesus and Judas equally aside. Why then do we pray to self-reliance? Inasmuch as the soul is present, there will be power not confident, but agent. To talk of reliance is a poor external way of speaking. Speak rather of that which relies, because it works, and it is. So I want you to remember those words. Power ceases in the instant of repose. It's almost like a kind of shark-like view of power. It consists in the darting to an aim, the crossing. See, that's why I think he's almost a kind of cosmopolitan thinker. He's thinking about bridging gaps, not closing them necessarily, but trying to think about the ways in which you might ford gulfs of thought, make unlike things have a connection to one another. And one of the things you might say about Emerson is that what links all of this together is the sense that you get in his writings of his own mind. I mean, his mind is what unifies all of these things together. And therefore, his writing becomes almost a kind of object lesson in how you, too, can make sense of contradiction in the world around you. Not by listening to everybody else, but by thinking for yourself, trusting in yourself, being the thing that unifies disparate modes of thinking, different kinds of ideas, different kinds of contradictions. All right, so that's why I just want you to see that as a kind of bedrock Emersonian concept, this idea of contradiction. It's going to be problematic. And then we could start to argue about it. Well, wait a minute. You just said contradiction, but what does it mean to say that isn't he kind of unifying and therefore subsuming contradiction? And yes. So there's almost a kind of contradiction in what I just said about his use of contradiction, which I think Emerson would be very happy about. So let's go back to Nature, 1836. This is page 1110. And again, you'll start to see now that having talked about some of these things and the trajectory of his thinking, you'll start to see what he's up to in this book, Nature. The epigraph comes from Plotinus. Nature is but an image or imitation of wisdom, the last thing of the soul, nature being a thing which doth only do and not know, but not know. Now, Plotinus is interesting for Emerson because Plotinus is thought of as one of the originary Neo-Platonic thinkers. Plotinus is also important for people like Winthrop. Remember, I talked to you a little bit about the ways in which the kinds of philosophy that would be identified as Platonic would be idealistic, as opposed to Aristotelian materialistic philosophy. That's good for the Puritans, insofar as Plato thinks that the real things are ideas, not the particular manifestation of the table, but the idea of the table. It's that idea that's real. Puritans can work with that, but part of what enables them to work with that is Plotinus, who starts to translate Plato's thought into a Christian context. Okay? He's important for Emerson as well. So immediately Emerson is using the epigraph to signal his philosophical relationships, establish his credibility, and also his genealogy of thinking. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers, the tombs of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. Now remember, what do you think about those genres? Remember, isn't that what I said was exactly the modes of what, if we had to call something literary in the 17th century, it would be these genres. The Bible, sure, and then biographies, histories, a little bit of criticism perhaps. The foregoing generations, Emerson writes, beheld God and nature face to face. We see through their eyes. Why should we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition? And a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs, right? Where have all the miracles gone? How come they were just then? Aren't there miracles going on now? How come we don't get any? Emerson probably is trying to suggest to you that we do, but we're not able to notice them. We've lost faith in them. We need them. Embosomed for a season in nature, whose floods of life stream around and through us and invite us by the powers they supply to act proportioned to nature, why should we grope among the dry bones of the past? Put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe. And now he's talking about thought and philosophies, these other genres, biographies, histories, criticism, right? We need new stuff for the new age. The sun shines today also, not just on them. We can have revelation too. There is more wool and flax in the fields. There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worships. Right? So one of the things that you would say about Emerson is he is adopting this idea that is a commonplace, that we are belated. We've come late into the world. And what Emerson would say is, there's the fall of man right there. It's the fact that we are bound to what other people have thought. We don't think for ourselves. We don't think the way they used to think. We don't experience the world the way they used to experience the world. We need to do that. And for him, the way is through self-reliance. And you just look at the boundless faith in human nature that seems to be here in these passages. Going on, undoubtedly we have no questions to ask which are unanswerable. We must trust the perfection of the creation so far as to believe that whatever curiosity the order of things has awakened in our minds, the order of things can satisfy. And you have to imagine that one of the things that Emerson and many of the other writers of this period are thinking about is the fact that Champollion has deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs very recently. This is kind of big discovery. These things that were completely mysterious now turn out to be a language. It gives them hope. The Rosetta Stone, right, in which certain hieroglyphs were translated into Greek, and we could read that, so then we were able to understand. Emerson uses this as an example of the new way of thinking that the 19th century is making available. Every man's condition is a solution in hieroglyphic to those inquiries he would put. He acts at his life before he apprehends it as truth. In like manner, nature is already in its forms and tendencies describing its own design. Right? You can see how this is linked to, but an extension of that kind of deism that I described with Franklin. Right? The idea that we deduce the existence of God by looking at manifestations of what has to be intention in the world. Emerson says this: let us interrogate the great apparition that shines so peacefully around us. Let us inquire, to what end is nature? So that's where he's starting off. But I want you to understand, this is taking off from natural philosophy, but it's really an inquiry into the self. This is a treatise that paves the way for the later thinking about self-reliance and modes of being self-reliant that you see not only in that essay, but in The American Scholar and other things that we're going to be reading of his. All science has one aim, namely to find a theory of nature. We have theories of races and of functions, but scarcely yet a remote approximation to an idea of creation. We are now so far from the road to truth, but religious teachers dispute and hate each other, and speculative men are esteemed unsound and frivolous. But to a sound judgment, the most abstract truth is the most practical. Whenever a true theory appears, it will be its own evidence. Its test is that it will explain all phenomena. Now many are thought not only unexplained, but inexplicable, as language, sleep, dreams, beasts, sex. I mean, put this in the context of Brown, right? Emerson believes that things like sleepwalking, the unconscious, give us time, give the world time, we'll be able to answer these kinds of questions. He does not, in other words, believe that there's some kind of flaw in human psychology, human consciousness, or human reason. We just don't know enough yet. That would be his reply to, you might say, the Gothic. Emerson is an absolutely non-Gothic thinker, although, as we'll see, most likely after the break, that he has a Gothic moment or two, which then he turns around and makes a reaffirmation of his individualistic philosophy. All right, here's a tough paragraph. Let's take a look at it. Philosophically considered, the universe is composed of nature and the soul. Strictly speaking, therefore, all that is separate from us, all which philosophy distinguishes as the not me, that is both nature and art, all other men in my own body must be ranked under the name nature. In enumerating the values of nature and casting up their sum, I shall use the word in both senses, in its common and in its philosophical import, much the way we've been talking about materialism or idealism. In inquiries so general as our present one, the inaccuracy is not material. No confusion of thought will occur. Nature in the common sense refers to essences unchanged by man. Space, the air, the river, the leaf. Art is applied to the mixture of his will with the same things, as in a house, a canal, a statue, a picture. But his operations taken together are so insignificant, a little chipping, baking, patching, and washing, that in an impression so grand as that of the world on the human mind, they do not vary the result. All right, there's a couple of important things to note in there. For one thing, what the hell is he talking about? What is nature in the philosophical, what counts as nature in the philosophical definition that he's invoking? Yeah?
Everything that is not his consciousness, that his consciousness can't change.
Okay, everything, that's good. Everything that is not his consciousness, that in some sense his consciousness can't change or that he takes as a kind of given. Including what, surprisingly, at the very end of the paragraph? His own body. Okay, so well, that makes sense. Body, biology, part of nature. But then, take a look at what he says a little bit. All right, well, let's stay with there. Is there anything else to add here that we want to say about this philosophical conception of nature? Yeah?
We differentiate between nature and art.
Okay, so nature and art. Nature is essences unchanged by man. Art, he says, is a mixture of his will of the same things. Now again, hovering in the background, the Lockean account of property. Remember what I told you. Where does property come? It's because you're born with property. It's called your body. When you mix your body's ability to labor, which is part of you, with nature, you get not art, property, more property. So think about what is going on in the translation of this from nature and property to nature and art. Is it not unlike, we might ask, life, liberty, and property from Locke, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from Jefferson? Is it what? Is it an idealization of this? Is it covering up something that we'd rather not talk about, that's a little inconvenient? There's one thing to bear in mind. People would say, just take a look at this, but his operations taken together are so insignificant, a little chipping, baking, patching, and washing, that an impression so grand as that of the world and the human mind, they do not vary the result. People would point to that and say, oh, Emerson, geez, 19th century thinker, he had no idea. This is all pre-industrial, he thinks the railroad is a good thing. If he could wake up today and look what we've done to nature, he'd realize that he was completely wrong. Right? We can change nature. We can destroy the world. We are destroying the world. I believe in global warming, personally. And, we've done that. Right? Yeah.
Well, then would he cease to call it nature really because we've had that effect on it?
Well, I guess, he would say, oh, geez, I guess we made a lot of art. All right, but having said that, anybody ever go to planetarium shows or look at pictures from the Hubble telescope or just think about all the freaking nature that's out there? What have we done to affect that? Come on, we are insignificant in a certain way. So Emerson is interested in that. So Emerson would, he would probably say, that's probably exactly what he'd say. Look, we have not affected. And yet, that's not where he wants to end up. What he wants to end up is the fact that we are not only not insignificant, we are absolutely significant. And that's because, again, not of what we do to nature, but of our connection to God. Last thing I want you to see, philosophically, the not me. Just to expand on what you're saying so we're absolutely clear on it. The only thing that is you, the only thing that is the me, is my soul. Or my consciousness, I suppose. But my soul. Everything else is part of the not me, even my body. Now think about that. When you look in the mirror, what do you think of as yourself? Would you be the same person if you're, maybe people, I don't know. I've never actually bleached my hair blonde or something, but if you were to change the way you look radically and have plastic surgery, you would say, well, yeah, it's just my body. That's not. Maybe we're more, we're more in tune with that idea. But what he wants to suggest is that the body is just a contingency. It's not really you. What you look like, what your gender is, or you can extrapolate from this, what your sexuality is, what your race is, all this kind of stuff. The idea that he's pushing is that all of these are contingent. That is what you might say puts him in a certain line of American philosophy that we would call individualistic. And I would even call ontologically individualistic, right? The society exists only afterwards. And all these things, but not only society, everything exists only afterwards. You're your soul first, that's you, and then a whole bunch of stuff gets added on, like a box to contain your soul. And it has to do with your beautiful blonde hair, or your beautiful brunette hair, or your beautiful blue eyes, or your beautiful brown eyes, or your beautiful mind. All that stuff is extra. I just want you to think about that because it's a really strange way of thinking. It's not a way that any of us experience being in the world. We are all born, as Emerson would say, belatedly. We're born into families. We're born into communities. We're born into a nation. We're born into a world. Really crappy things have happened in the world before us that we have had nothing to do with, and yet have to live with the consequences of. That question of belatedness is a big one for Emerson. And what Emerson does not want, Emerson wants to find modes of thinking that will keep us from being hampered, harnessed, constrained by that idea of belatedness. Okay? So one of the things Emerson would say is that idea of the me we need to hang on to. The me is connected to the reason, to the soul. Later on in some of his essays, he goes on to develop an idea that he calls the oversoul. It's kind of like the sum total of all souls, and it's the thing that in some sense is a conduit between human beings and the divine. So I want you to see that Emerson is pushing these individualistic ideas farther than any Puritan would, but even further than Franklin would. He's giving them a kind of inflection. So you might say this is another solution to the problem of religion and enlightenment, or spirituality and enlightenment, right? Edwards has one solution, Franklin has one solution, Emerson has another solution. All right, I'm going to skip over talking about Swedenborg because I don't think it's as important as thinking about that image. And then we'll end there for today. Anybody remember this? This is one of the famous moments in nature. And as you can see, it was quickly caricatured in the popular press. This is on page 1112. Now again, think about your Edwards as a proto-romantic thinker. Edwards valorizes nature. Nature becomes an example that he can use. He gives him models for enlightenment. Edwards already is veering away from Bradford. Emerson's going to push it even further. Nature becomes the grounds of revelation. We study nature, we study the self. Nature becomes our conduit to the self. By studying the self, we study the divine. Okay, so nature is not depraved. We are not depraved. In fact, nature becomes a form, a place where revelation can happen. Emerson is a romantic thinker insofar as he also agrees, you might say, that somehow adults have forgotten. Right? The children are closer to the Godhead. There's that wonderful poem that Wordsworth writes, Intimations, the ode, Intimations of Immortality. Right? People have read that in Britlet too? Intimations of Immortality. It's about how the child comes down and streaming all these kind of godlike qualities, and then it gets kind of really depressing because all of a sudden, as the child gets older, it gets more constrained, and Wordsworth had to stop. Couldn't figure out where to go next. It's like got himself into a real deep writing funk because he couldn't figure out what to do. He's painted this situation in which you're only getting further and further from God as you grow older. And finally, there's a moment, there's a kind of break in the poem, and then he says, oh, but in those embers, like the fire is going out, no, there's a little bit of embers, we can rekindle it. And that's, I guess, what poetry does. So Emerson is along the same lines here. To speak truly, few adult persons can see nature. Most persons do not see the sun. At least they have a very superficial seeing. The sun illuminates only the eye of the man, but shines into the eye and heart of the child. The lover of nature is he whose inward and outward senses are still truly adjusted to each other, who has retained the spirit of infancy even into the era of manhood. Right? Now skip a few sentences on. Nature is a setting that fits equally well a comic or a mourning piece. In good health, the air is a cordial of incredible virtue. And he's going to explain that. Crossing a bare common. Now people often think that this transparent eyeball thing takes place in the woods. Not necessarily. It can happen in the common. People think this was Cambridge Common, right? It's kind of like Washington Square Park. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune. Again, think of Edwards with the sun, with the thunder, right? This is going to be a moment of revelation. I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. Almost I fear to think how glad I am. In the woods too, so also can happen in the city, can happen in the woods. A man casts off his years as the snake his slough, and at what period soever of life is always a child. In the woods is perpetual youth. Within these plantations of God a decorum and sanctity reign, a perennial festival is dressed, and the guest sees not how he should tire of them in 1,000 years. In the woods we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me eyes. Right? So eyes is a privileged sense for him. We'll talk about that more. Which nature cannot repair. And then here's the moment. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air, uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. Note the words. It's not all egotism that vanishes. It's all mean egotism that vanishes. We still keep some egotism. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. Think back to your Edward Taylor. Isn't this kind of a weird Taylor-like image? And it's again that contradiction. I see nothing, right? I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. Yes, he is talking about electricity. It's Franklinian too. I am part or particle of God. The name of the nearest friend sounds then foreign and accidental. To be brothers, to be acquaintances, master or servants, is then a trifle and a disturbance. Think of Hutchinson on sanctification. All this stuff is extra. I'm just having this moment. To be brothers, to be acquaintances, masters or servants is then a trifle and a disturbance. I am the lover of uncontained and immortal beauty. In the wilderness I find something more dear and connate than in streets or villages. Again, society, a necessary evil. In the tranquil landscape, and especially in the distant line of the horizon, man beholds somewhat as beautiful as his own nature. His own nature. Nature out there is a poor copy of your own nature. I want you to see this as a kind of synthetic moment where a lot of the building blocks that we've been investigating up until this point are re-synthesized into something else, into an Emersonian philosophy of self-reliance. All right, we're going to leave it there because we did not finish with Emerson. No American scholar, no experience on the midterm. We will only nature and self-reliance are fair game, and one of them will be there in the passages. So, hope you've thought about what I've been saying, but not the other two, just those two. All right? Good luck with your preparation. I'll see you here bright and early before 2 o'clock on Wednesday. Here bright and early before 2 o'clock on Wednesday.